Thank you, Pastor Brad, and it's great to be here with you this week. For a guy that grew up in Ohio, being back in Kansas is kind of like going home. Small towns near where I grew up are a lot like Hillsboro, so it's been this fun little trip down memory lane for me this week, and we've just been great to be here on your campus. We want to talk this morning about building walls or bridges, engaging the journey of social justice, and I want to share with you how God has expanded my world in the last couple of years. But before we do that, a little bit of baseball talk. Spring training's around the corner. I think your season has started here for baseball. Is that right? Did I see on the website you're like, 25-10 or something so far? That's a pretty good start. Anyone here want to be a minor league baseball player someday? All right, we got at least one in the crowd. So minor league baseball is not as glamorous as it appears. Lots of long bus rides, low pay, all this kind of stuff. So there was this minor league baseball player who in the off season to try and make ends meet worked as a police officer. One day he pulls a guy over, was doing 61 in a 55-mile-an-hour zone. The driver pled for mercy. I've never had a ticket. I was just barely over that 5-mile-per-hour limit that we all know is really where the limit should be. Please let me off. Well, the baseball player / police officer said, you got to take it up with the traffic judge. Anyone here feel the pain of the driver? Can I see your hands? A few honest people here. Anyways, 2 months later, it's opening day. This police officer / baseball player is walking to home plate. He's the leadoff batter. And he sees this umpire. And he goes, this face is familiar. And suddenly it comes back to him. It's that driver that he gave a ticket to. So now he's wrestling with, do I break the ice? Do I just ignore this? What's going to be better for me? So finally he kind of clears his throat and says, how'd it go with that traffic judge? Umpire looks straight ahead at the pitcher, puts his mask on and says, swing at everything, they're all strikes. Now here's the question. Was that justice? Was that fair? If you were the driver, would you have felt that the ticket was fair and just? Technically, it was. You were breaking the law. But if you look at the whole story of this driver's record, it doesn't feel quite as fair. I mean, we all get a break now and then, right? If you're the umpire, does it feel just? Does it feel fair to say, swing at everything, they're all strikes? If you were the umpire, how many of you would have said the same thing? Oh, good. Again, a few honest people in the crowd. My point in all this is to say justice, which we talk about a lot. And in discussions, we often talk about right, wrong, these sort of clinical sort of way. But all of us view justice and view fairness. It's shaped by our history. It's shaped by our story. It's shaped by what we have experienced so far. And that is true when we look at the justice issues that are true in our world today. How would the story be different if we add some details? So suppose the police officer was a person of color and the driver was the eldest son of a well-connected politician. Would the story have played out differently? Happens all the time in our world. So when we talk about justice, if we want to be about the work of justice, we have to cultivate this ability to see from the perspective of other people. And that's the work God has been doing in my life in the last year or two. I might also say that justice is not just a social issue. Justice is a faith issue. If you read the Scriptures, if you're shaped by the story of the Scriptures, you cannot escape this. All through the Old Testament, there are issues of justice. In fact, if you're familiar with the story of how God's people went into exile, a significant reason why they did is because they failed to pay attention to matters of justice. If you look in the New Testament, Jesus talks about it a lot, and the Apostle Paul talks about it a lot as well. In Ephesians chapter 2, Paul is talking about the implications of the work of Christ. If you grew up in evangelical churches, you probably heard Ephesians 2, 8, 9, and 10 a lot. We're saved by faith, by God's grace. Nothing that we can do, it's God's grace. And that's how you're personally saved. And then we tend to stop there. But if you keep right on reading after that, Paul then says, therefore, because of what Christ's done, and then he goes into about 10 verses where he talks about justice. In verses 11 through 13, he talks about the Jew and the Gentile. He talks about how they were often excluded, how they were foreigners. There's languages of separation, of distinction. And then Paul continues and says, Christ has a different way. He says this in verses 14. He says, for he himself, that is Christ, he is our peace. He has made the two groups one. He's done this by destroying the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. Now, this doesn't mean we do away with our ethnic and cultural distinctions. That's part of our human experience. But Paul is saying before people encountered Christ, they tended to lead with that. Their focus was on how we are different. There were walls that they built to try and identify themselves, to protect themselves. Walls have a place, don't they? They give us security, they give us a sense of identity, but they also exclude. And then Paul continues. He says, consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but you're now fellow citizens in God's people, and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. In him the whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. Paul's intent is that instead of being separate people, we focus on our shared humanity and work for God's kingdom. Now you can read this passage and say all the people in the old days, these Jews, the Gentiles, and these walls were real. Like if you walked into the temple, there were signs that said, oh, a Gentile can enter into here at the threat of death. And we can say, well, they were all just a bunch of crazy racists. But I don't think that's fair. They thought they were following God, but they were not realizing all the walls that they had constructed. Be interesting. I wish we had the time, but we don't. To have some of you share, what are some of the walls you've encountered? What are some of the walls perhaps you've constructed? What are some of the walls that even in our churches we construct at times? And what do they give to us? In my experience, I thought I didn't have a whole lot of walls. I was born in Alabama, and I heard my mom talking about how she grew up in an era when there were still signs, no coloreds in this bathroom. That's literally what it said on the wall. She talked about teachers who, with this visceral hatred, described how they hated Abraham Lincoln because he had freed the slaves. And my mom told me how she would go and talk to this teacher and say, you're a minister's wife. How can you hate people? And this teacher started crying and said, I know it's wrong, but I was taught that since I was 3. I looked at my grandfather, who was a chaplain in the state prison in Alabama, and how this was back in the 70s and 80s. He would hire some ex-cons, some people who had served time, to come and work at his business. That was unheard of back then. And these people became almost a part of our family. So I had this sense that I grew up in a family that's actually quite open, quite embracing, quite progressive, if you will, when it comes to issues of justice and racial equality. And in some ways, that's true. But I had no idea of some of the walls that still existed in my life. And I had no idea of how certain positions I held and things I supported continued to support some of these walls in ways that I was completely oblivious to. In the last 2 years, God has brought people into my life that has helped me realize there are systemic walls that still constrain people and rob people of the same opportunities that I've had. And so I realized, how can I be a part of working to overcome those walls? One of the people that God brought into my life was a coworker. His name was Rip. Rip is an African American. He's in his 50s, probably late 50s. He grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Last summer, you may remember the one police shooting that was on the news from Tulsa, Oklahoma, where there was a man who was up against the car and he was shot by an officer. I went to Rip the next day and said, can we talk about this? How are you feeling? How does this impact you? Can you talk to me about your experience as a black man in America? And he started to tell me what it was like to grow up in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the 60s. Rip said, have you ever heard about the Tulsa Black Wall Street riot? Has anyone here ever heard of that? Very, very few. 1921. Tulsa was known as Black Wall Street. There was a thriving African-American middle class in Tulsa. They said if there ever has been a place in the U.S. where the black community achieved the American dream, it was in Tulsa. They had their own banking system. It was thriving. On Memorial Day of that year, a riot broke out. There was involvement from the KKK. There was involvement from the police with the KKK. And this entire community was wiped out. 35 blocks destroyed. $30 million in today's dollars were damaged. There were literally airplanes. 1921. How many people owned airplanes in 1921? There were airplanes flying over the black community and throwing down burning turpentine balls to try and start fires on the homes. This is significant. This is terrorism on U.S. soil. Why had I never heard about that in any of my lessons? And then Rip described how 40 years later, when he was a child in Tulsa, the ripples were still impacting his community. It never recovered. And Rip told me about how as a 19-year-old, he realized he was being targeted by 2 police officers. He said, I knew I had to leave or I would end up in jail even though I hadn't committed a crime. And then he continued to talk. Talked about his children. Talked about how he had his talk with his son, what to do if you're stopped by a police officer. So the thing I told him is, never ever reach for your wallet. Even if the police officer says you can reach for your wallet, never reach for your wallet. I realized that has never been my experience. But if that's been your experience, how will that shape how you view some of the things in the news these days? Rip talked as well about a friend of his in Fresno. This just happened in the last year. Young man. His dad is an African-American pastor. He's in college. He's trying to pay his way through college by being a pizza delivery driver. In the last 18 months, as he's delivered pizzas around Fresno, how many times do you think he's been stopped? Think it's 10? Is that too high or too low? Too low? 20? High or low? Low? 30? too high? 40 times. In the last year, he has been stopped 40 times. Now, out of those 40 times, how many tickets do you think he's received? 0. When he realizes that, when the police officer realizes he's just working, they let him off. How do you explain that? Unless there's some kind of bias that's behind all that. This is what I mean when I say justice is not just this clinical, detached view of a particular incident that happens. It's shaped by our story. It's shaped by our history. I think about sitting with an African-American colleague who, with this mixture of pain, sadness, and anger, says, when there's a crack epidemic in the inner city, the politicians talk about 3 strikes and you're out. When there's a heroin opiate epidemic in the suburbs, the same politicians talk about we need more money for rehab. These are the things that shape our reality. And if we think that we can look at every issue and every video and every incident in isolation from all this stuff, we're kidding ourselves. All of us view justice through the lens of our experience. I've also had a chance to be at the border, down at the Mexico and U.S. border. This is a picture of the wall that has already been built. This is a picture taken from the Mexican side in Agua Prieta. And this picture captures for me 2 different approaches that I have seen. One is a wall that builds up and excludes. The other approach is people who are reaching out, trying to bridge the divide that wall causes and connect people. I've sat with Border Patrol, heard them talk, heard them wrestle with, on the one hand, they face the danger of the cartel. On the other hand, the people that they actually catch are primarily women and children who have risked their life and all of their life savings to flee violence and intimidation back in Central America. So on the one hand, these Border Patrol agents are putting themselves in harm's way. On the other hand, the people they are catching are people like you and me, just trying, not even to better their lives, just trying to survive. I think about the lady I met in Tucson who was picked up in a random traffic stop. She's been here for 17 years. She was brought here as a teenager. She has 3 children born in the U.S. that are American citizens. Her husband is an American citizen. Together, they run a landscaping business. She's very active in the PTA. This is the kind of family that every elementary school wants active in their school. But because she happened to cross a border as a minor, she now faces being deported. And as I sat there and listened to her story, I thought, 15 years. Most violent crimes have a statute of limitations less than that. So I could assault you, and if I get away with it for 10 years, legally I'm scot-free. But if I happen to cross some arbitrary political border, legally in our current system, it could hang over my head forever. How is that just? How is that humane? As a Christian, how does that help us build that vision that Paul had that says God wants all humanity to be one, worshiping Christ together? I could tell more experiences, but these are the things that God has used to make me realize that I had this unbelievable wall in my life because I had not been able to put myself in the shoes of someone else whose life experience was different than mine. Yes, I may not have been this obnoxious, out there racist who was openly bigoted. but I fail to think about how things I support, how actions I'm engaged in, can actually perpetuate a system that harms those whose life experience is different than mine. So what do we do about all this? How do we become people who are like the hands reaching out to make a difference? Because I saw people like that at the border as well. And you go, those are the kind of people that I want to be like. So for me, it's done a couple of things. It has changed my politics. I'm actually starting to call my congressmen and call my senators to just be a voice for those who don't often have a voice. You may have heard of my congressman. He's in the news a lot these days. His name is Devin Nunes. He's not exactly a receptive listener. It's not the issue. My calling as someone who believes in the justice that God wants is to be a witness. I've realized that I have to stay centered. Because if I get angry at all these injustices, which is good to be angered, but angry crusaders rarely bring about lasting change. Martin Luther King Jr. is a great example of this. Passionate in speaking against injustice, but always with the vision of what the future could be. You have to stay centered in order to get heard. And the third thing it's done for me is to remind me that with God, all things are possible. There's a story of 4 nuns. They worked in a hospital. They were driving somewhere, and they ran out of gas with their car. The only container in the car was a bedpan from the hospital where they worked. They walked up to the nearest exit, got all the gas in this bedpan that they could, came back to their vehicle, and they were pouring it into their car. A trucker was going by, and he saw them, and he pulled over, and he said, "Sisters, I admire your faith, but I don't think it's going to work." Sometimes the work of justice feels that way. It feels impossible. But I've talked to people who've personally been in Germany when the Berlin Wall fell. I've talked to people who personally were in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was released and apartheid was officially ended. I talked to an Israeli activist in Israel who is working to overcome the injustices there. And I said, "What gives you hope?" And every single one of these said, "We study history, and every unjust thing comes to an end at some point. And you often don't know when. It just breaks loose." So you never give up hope. You always just speak for the justice that needs to be done. What can you do? What do I wish I had done when I was your age? I won't say how many years ago. Let me encourage you to do a couple things. Learn. Intentionally read of people whose experiences are different from you. John Perkins, civil rights warrior for years, pastor from Mississippi, just came out with a new book, Dream With Me. Get it and read it. Brian Stevenson, a lawyer from Atlanta, who has spent his life helping overturn peoples who've been wrongly convicted to death. He wrote a book called Just Mercy. It's gripping, it's compelling, it's all stories, especially if you are from a majority culture, you should read this. It will open your eyes to some of the walls that exist in our world. Mennonite Central Committee, and there's an office here in Newton, not that far away. They can help you get to the border and see for yourself some of this. They can help you go through an experience called the loss of Turtle Island, which helps you hear the story that the Native Americans have experienced that you probably have not heard in your schools so far. Prepare yourself for the future. Someday you will be business owners. You will be hiring managers. Will you be the kind of business owner, will you be the kind of hiring manager who says, "I will intentionally reach out to those who don't have a natural opportunity"? Just Sunday, I read a story in the Fresno paper about how the Japanese were put into internment camps back during World War II. And they talked about the farmers that intentionally hired them, even when everyone else refused to hire them. Be that kind of person when you have that opportunity. But not just read. Engage with someone whose experience has been different from yours. Befriend them. Reach out. Have conversations. Do whatever you can to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. There's an African proverb that says, in times of crisis, the foolish build walls and the wise build bridges. I heard this last year from a Nigerian. What's happening in Nigeria these days? There's a group called Boko Haram, terrorist group. And I sat there and I thought, if someone who is living under the threat of that kind of terrorist group can say, this is the way to live. Build bridges, not walls. That's the kind of person I want to be. And I challenge you, be that kind of person as well. Thanks. Have a great day. And God bless you as you work for his justice.